plant and animals and plenty of interesting events. Hedgerows are a feature of this Irish countryside, so let's take a closer look at what's in a hedge. It is not always realised that our landscape is almost entirely created by human intervention. Once all of this was dense forest, but our Bronze and Iron Age ancestors began to make changes. They cleared areas of woodland to plant crops and graze livestock. They weren't very good farmers, however, and after taking a few crops from an area, they soon impoverished the soil. They just moved on and started again somewhere else. Gradually, the great forests were broken up and reduced. In their place was an open landscape of farmland and rough grazing. The centuries of clearance for agriculture have left only a tiny remnant of native forests covering less than 1% of the land. Many of our woodland animals and plants now find refuge in the thousands of miles of hedgerows that were planted long after the forests were cleared. As farming practice became more organised, fields were enclosed with fences, stone walls and hedges. The first major hedge planting occurred in Ireland about 1750, and within 100 years the situation was pretty much as it is today. Given its sheltered conditions and the fact that it is a great reservoir of wildlife, the hedgerow is one of the best places to look for the first signs of spring. Most mature hedges consist of a dense shrub layer, often a mixture of blackthorn, hawthorn and briars. One of the earliest shrubs to flower is the blackthorn. From early April, before any leaves have appeared on the trees, sprays of white blackthorn flowers begin to brighten the hedgerows. The blackthorn, or sloe, as it is also called, is widespread throughout Ireland, and in some places complete hedges of it can be found. The wood of the blackthorn is traditionally used in the making of walking sticks. In good years, masses of flowers are produced and the bushes appear as if they are covered in snow. The blackthorn and the very closely related hawthorn are members of the rose family, but the blackthorn differs from most of the other species as the flowers appear before the leaves. The five-petaled white flowers are very rich in pollen and nectar and attract many insect visitors. At this time of year, when there are very few other flowers available, hoverflies, bees and other insects swarm around the blackthorn. These insects benefit the plants as they are agents of pollination and therefore help the plants to reproduce. A distinct herbaceous layer occurs at ground level. It generally consists of a mixture of well-known countryside plants. Among the most conspicuous of the early spring flowers in this layer are the lesser celandines, with their glossy star-shaped flowers. Celandines, close relatives of the buttercups, can flower as early as February and are considered true signs that the worst of winter has passed. The primrose was once a woodland flower but has adapted well to life in a hedge. The shade-loving plant takes advantage of the damp and shady conditions similar to that of a wood. Several species of fern reappear at this time of year. The young fronds are rolled up like a spring to protect the delicate tips from damage as they are pushed up through the soil and litter. Both the male fern and the hart's tongue fern are common in woods and hedgerows throughout the country, especially where there is lime in the soil. As spring advances and April gives way to May, the cow parsley begins to take over along the hedge. With its delicate lacy white flowers, cow parsley must surely be the most characteristic plant of roadside verges. The mass of flowers acts as a great attraction to a whole host of spring insects seeking nectar and pollen. Tall trees such as elm, oak, beech, ash and sycamore are scattered along the hedgerows, creating a broken canopy. These trees act as hosts to all kinds of woodland creatures. Unfortunately, many of the fine elms are now dead, victims of Dutch elm disease. This disease is caused by a parasitic fungus which is carried from tree to tree by a tiny tree beetle. The effect on the landscape has been devastating and irreversible. The oldest hedges are often those marking some local boundary or running alongside an old road. In general, the older a hedge is, the more species of tree and shrub it will contain. You can estimate the age of a hedge by simply counting the number of shrub and tree species present. On average, it takes 100 years for a new species to become established. Here, along the side of the old Enniskerry roadway in County Wicklow, the hedge contains a variety of trees and may be several hundred years old. Apart from the hawthorn and blackthorn, one of the most common trees in this hedge is the ash. It is a native species and is particularly associated with limestone areas. The sycamore, on the other hand, is not a native species, although since its introduction in the 16th century, it has spread vigorously throughout the country, growing easily from seed. It is one of the hardiest of tree species, growing in exposed coastal locations as well as in heavily polluted towns. The variety and abundance of plants in a hedge varies greatly from place to place. The type of soil, its drainage, and the climate are all major influences. On the rich limestone lowlands, where the pH is around 7.5, the hawthorn flowers throughout May and June and is the most common hedgerow bush. Here there are many tall trees. But on more acid soils, where the pH varies from 5 to 6.5, hawthorn is mixed with blackthorn and ash. Firs may also be present, while tall trees are more scarce. Stitchwort is a hedgerow plant of these acid soils, and its white flowers form a carpet along the verges in May. Higher on the slopes and where the ground is stony, hawthorn gives way to firs. It's a pioneer shrub that rapidly colonizes open ground before other plants become established. In medieval times, firs hedges were planted, however, they were not very stock-proof. Fuchsia is an exotic species introduced from South America, which has become common in Irish hedges, particularly in the southwest of the country. In Irish, it's called Deori Day, God's tears. In wetter areas like Cavan, Leitrim and the south of Clare, there are many hedges consisting almost entirely of willow. An unusual thing about willow is that each bush is either male or female, instead of having both sexes together in the same flower. The willow is another species which, like the blackthorn, flowers before producing its leaves. Animals that live in and close to the hedges use them as convenient corridors through which they can travel in relative safety across open ground from one patch of cover to the next. Rabbits, rats and mice make short trips into the fields to feed, and predators such as foxes use them as cover for stalking their prey. This vixen is out hunting for rabbits in the early morning, checking along the hedge bank where they have their burrows. Rats have their burrows at the base of the hedge too. Here, grain has spilt from a passing truck and the rats have overcome their usual caution to avail of the feast. There are two kinds of rat found in Ireland, the scarce black rat found only in large cities, and this, the common or brown rat, which is widespread. Rats can be a very serious pest. They steal eggs, spoil food, spread disease, and are generally disliked. In spring and early summer, the hedgerow birds are busy holding territory and nesting. The male chaffinch sings out from the top of a tall tree. The willow warbler has just arrived from Africa. Its nest will be well hidden among the vegetation at the bottom of the hedge. While the robin feeds mainly on the ground, on grubs and other small insects, the spotted flycatcher takes his food from high up in the trees. This sharing of resources is common among birds and mammals living together. The hedgerow is a particularly rich habitat, preserving the characteristic of both woodland and open field. The robin, the chaffinch and the willow warbler are all basically woodland birds which have adapted to life in the hedge. But there are other species here too, like the whitethroat and the yellowhammer, which were once birds of open scrubland. A very common and familiar hedgerow nester is the song thrush. Song thrushes often nest in garden hedges, and this one is feeding 4 youngsters in a nearby privet hedge. Young song thrushes spend almost a fortnight in the nest before they are ready to fly. These youngsters are quite well grown and both parents are kept busy supplying them with a constant stream of food. The large domed nest of the magpie is a common sight in tall hedgerow trees. But just occasionally, they will build an open nest low down in a bush. Magpies are very successful breeders and are increasing throughout the country, even in towns and cities. In Ireland, they now breed in every county. From June onwards, the wild roses are in bloom, and they are undoubtedly the most conspicuous and beautiful of the midsummer hedgerow flowers. There are more than a dozen different species of rose in this country, all very similar and found in hedges, but the most common is the field rose and the dog rose. The flowers of the dog rose are a pale pink or sometimes white and faintly scented. The briars of this rose are long and straggling and armed with fiercely hooked thorns. The dog rose is very important to other wildlife in the hedge. Flies and bees of a number of species visit the flowers. The yellow flowers of the dandelion brighten the hedge bottom throughout the year. Playing clocks with the seed heads of a dandelion is every child's delight. Each tiny seed is suspended from a parachute of fine hairs, and they are blown by the wind and carried over long distances, which helps to disperse the species to new areas. The tiny speedwell or veronica appears in early summer. The hogweed, common in summer hedgerows, is very similar to the closely related cow parsley of spring. It too provides pollen and nectar for a whole host of insects. With all these flowers rich in nectar and pollen, it is only natural that there would be bees about. Several species of bumblebee and these honeybees live along the hedge. Bees can travel up to several kilometres in search of flowers, but usually they work as near the hive as possible. This hive is situated in a hole of an old tree. There is great activity at this time of year, with the workers bringing food for the young larvae in the hive, as well as laying down supplies for the coming winter. Nettles always grow best where the soil is fertile and has been recently disturbed, as for example by badger's set. Ditches and hedge bottoms are favourite sites, and the nettles will grow in extensive patches. Nettle beds support an extremely rich insect population despite their apparently unfriendly nature. The caterpillars of several butterflies feed on stinging nettles. These are the larvae of the peacock butterfly. Peacocks are one of the few butterflies which lay their eggs in large clutches, and the caterpillars remain together until they are mature. Despite being very obvious, the peacock caterpillars are well protected from predators. They are armed with rows of stiff black spines which make them very unpalatable to birds. More normally, however, caterpillars live singly, and individuals of several species are also found on the nettles. This is the caterpillar of the small tortoiseshell. After some time, the caterpillars undergo a dramatic change. Within this chrysalis, the peacock caterpillar is slowly growing into a butterfly. Many moth caterpillars develop in the same way, but others spin a cocoon of silken threads within which the chrysalis or pupa develops. This parsnip moth caterpillar is weaving its cocoon within the seeding head of a hogweed on which it has been feeding. These threads are very fine and strong. Wild silk is in fact produced from the cocoons of a species of moth that lives on mulberry in warmer countries. The red admiral with boldly patterned wings is another of the familiar species. None of these butterflies is totally dependent on hedgerows, but the disappearance of more and more wild patches is greatly reducing their numbers. Butterflies need wild flowers, so a good hedgerow is an oasis for them. The abundance of caterpillars and other insects at this time of year provides a plentiful supply of food to nesting birds. This robin has its nest nearby, but instead of a brood of 5 young robins, it is feeding 1 cuckoo chick. Cuckoos arrive from their African winter quarters in April and lay their eggs in the nests of other birds. The young cuckoo hatches out first and then throws the other eggs from the nest, thereby ensuring it gets all its foster parents' attention. The robin has to work overtime to bring an endless stream of caterpillars, worms and moths to this unusual offspring. The cuckoo chick grows rapidly, and by the time it leaves the nest it will be more than twice the weight of its foster parents. In the autumn, the young cuckoo will successfully make its way south to Africa with no guidance at all, a remarkable feat. A hole in a dead hogweed stem. It could have been made by any one of a large number of small animals. The larvae of some insects live in the hollows of these stems. This hole was made by the moth caterpillar. Within the world of a hedge, there is many a small universe. To some animals, this hogweed stem is itself a habitat, if only a temporary one. Here is the pupa of a small parsnip moth. Earlier in the season, the young caterpillars that we saw feeding on the hogweed flowers have now come down into the stem to pupate or develop. Earwigs and ladybirds crawl into these hollow stems for warmth and protection. There are a number of earwigs taking shelter in this stem. They like to pack closely together if they can. Later in the autumn, they will be seeking out sites like this in which to hibernate. Other insects will overwinter as eggs, larvae or pupae. All of these dormant insects help to supplement the vegetarian diet of small mammals and birds. These moth larvae are dead, which is not surprising because the tiny insects you see running along the stem are little parasitic wasps which kill the larvae. The female makes her way in here and lays eggs on the surface of the moth larvae. The young wasps burrow into the moth and feed on its internal organs, slowly killing it. When the wasps are fully grown, they all emerge together like this and fly off. In late summer, the elder begins to flower, adding a splash of creamy white to the hedgerows. As summer draws to a close, the final broods are leaving their nests. Although these 2 baby song thrushes have just left the nest, parents will find them to feed them by listening to their calls. This young goldfinch hasn't yet taken on the colourful head of the adult. The young thrushes will keep to the safety of the hedge until they can fly properly. The spotted flycatcher is having a last feast of insects to build up its reserve for the migration ahead. Swallows are gathering and hunting low along the hedgerows. Soon they too will be gone, heading south to winter in the reed beds of southern Africa. This blackberry hedge is like a huge food store at this time of year. The overripe berries are particularly attractive to insects such as wasps. The hedgerow provides not only food, but also cover and protection throughout the year. In winter, mice and squirrels bury or hide caches of seeds and fruit. For this woodmouse, an empty whitethroat's nest makes a handy larder. Haws, blackberries and rose hips have been gathered and hidden here while the nest also acts as a feeding platform. Even as the woodmouse eats, it is constantly on the alert. It has so many natural enemies that it can never really relax. Adaptations such as long whiskers, very sensitive eyes and large ears help it to detect a predator before it's too late. Even a passing shadow will make it freeze or jump. After a feed of sticky elderberries, the woodmouse carefully washes its paws and face. Being an excellent climber, the woodmouse can use the hedge from basement to top floor. Autumn is a time of plenty for the fruit eaters among the hedgerow animals. The fruit of the blackthorn is the sloe, the ancestor of all our cultivated plums. But the wild sloe is far too acidic for most people's palates. Some trees, such as this ash, have their seeds spread by the wind, whereas others are dispersed along the hedge by birds and small mammals. Most berries are eaten for their outer fleshy coat. The hard seeds pass through the animal unchanged. In fact, the germination of seeds is greatly helped by passing through an animal's digestive system. After the strain of a long breeding season, the birds are now building up reserves of fat for the winter by feeding on the seasonal succession of berries and seeds. The bullfinch is eating the red berries of the honeysuckle or woodbine, while the blackbird is feeding on the berries of the mountain ash or rowan. After devouring the autumn harvest of elderberries and blackberries, birds turn to haws and rosehips, then sloes, and finally to holly and ivy berries. For generations, hedges have provided shelter for livestock and have protected bare fields from the erosive effects of winter winds. In recent years, life on Irish farms has changed considerably. As farms grow larger, fewer boundaries are needed, while increased mechanisation requires bigger fields. Both of these developments have led to the destruction of hundreds of miles of hedges. In many parts of the country, a landscape dotted with trees and hedges is becoming a thing of the past.
Along river and canal banks, hedgerows have a special importance. By acting as a buffer zone between farmland and the water, they prevent runoff of not only soil, but worse still, slurry and fertilisers. In this way, the waterways are safeguarded from pollution. Where rivers are dredged and channeled to speed runoff, like this one, the banks are routinely stripped of their hedges. This provides a temptation to farm right up to the river's edge, often with disastrous results.
To be functional, a hedge must be managed, and until recently, this work was a regular part of the farming cycle. Nowadays, it is becoming rare to find a farmer who looks after his hedges in the traditional way. It takes skill to use a slasher and scythe correctly. Those with the skills are mostly the older generation. The younger folk are not learning the crafts. Autumn or early winter is the best time for carrying out hedging work. Verges can be cut and drainage ditches cleared with the least disturbance to wildlife. A mechanical digger could do this work in less than half the time, but would be very clumsy and destructive. Mechanical trimming is best carried out in the late winter when the wildlife will be least affected. But this is seldom considered, and the work is usually done when the funds and the machinery are available. If cutting is done in autumn, valuable food for birds and other animals is lost. Cutting in spring and early summer is even more drastic, with damage done to the young growing shoots and birds' nests destroyed.
As agriculture becomes more mechanised, hedges are removed to make large workable fields out of small parcels of land. This is happening at an alarming rate, and parts of the Midland are now quite prairie-like. But hedges probably won't vanish totally, for there will always be places where shelter is wanted and where a natural boundary is most easily marked by a hedge. These wildlife refuges, no more than a few hundred years old, are now an essential part of the natural environment.